The biggest question in the whole British big cat research field is there a population? You know, it's fair enough to assume there may be the odd cat wandering around, and actually the official status for these cats in the UK is, and it's been said by people in documentaries such as Chris Packham, that there probably is the odd cat roaming around. Now, obviously, that's fair enough, but how much of a step is it to say there's an actual population? Now, Rick Minter did a group discussion about this, and I think he did this in a good context. Basically, we got into groups and we decided, you know, the camp that believed there could be less than 50 animals spread out throughout the whole UK, with different species in that group. They got into one group. Another group was under 500, and the next group was 500 plus, and this was for different species. So quite a wide spectrum within three groups. And one of the things that the exercise showed is that we learned quite a lot about the cliche type opinions. We also you know, valued the fact that yes, there possibly could be less animals, but what the overall program showed us was that actually, in order to have the amount of sightings that we have, the amount of activity that we have, especially in clusters in certain areas, it's actually quite apparent. It's quite possible we could have a meta population across the UK. So a very interesting exercise to actually, you know, make statements of how many cats we think are out there and the reasons for that. It's probably the biggest question, and it's probably the one thing that we'll never ever be able to prove. Are there big cats in the UK? Probably, almost certainly. How many? Another big question, but if they're breeding and they're a population, that's another huge question. It's not something that we're going to be able to go out. One thing I was talking about on another video, it's not one thing we're going to do is just go out there and find out for certain. That's going to be the biggest one. Now, obviously, to make the point clear about leopards is, obviously, with a lot of the research that's been done and some of the recent research, we now know that territory sizes can be smaller. Not only can they be smaller, it's possible for cats to live in an area for years, even in an area like India, even in one of the biggest cities in the world. And I tell you, I've been to Mumbai, and I'm going back to Mumbai in a few days as well to meet Krishna. And I tell you what, it's a lot more densely populated than London. And some of the actual leopard conflict which has occurred there is a lot more severe, in the sense that it's in a much more densely populated high-rise area than just the outskirts. You know, for these animals to come into such a, and it is a very modern city, Mumbai, it's absolutely amazing that these wilderness animals are doing that. So for us to even conceive that there's a population in the UK is not actually as far-fetched. I think one thing we've got to remember in Britain is a lot of the fauna and species which are there haven't always been there. You know, when the Ice Age came in Britain, it reduced our fauna down to a particular number of species, and that's why a lot of the landscape type plants we see in the UK and are used on commercial developments are usually of a Japanese or a Chinese origin on the same latitude. They like the same temperatures as the UK, but we actually have a very basic sphere of vegetative species, because in Britain and what that little area which was left just below the Chilterns, there was very few species which, you know, that can take a warm climate stayed, whereas in China a lot of the species were treated and were treated back again with the ice caps. So a lot of the species, and a very interesting point I want to actually make here today, is a lot of the species in the UK that we commonly think of as acceptable populations is actually far-fetched from what we actually think is native to our shores. And I know that there's always an issue of race, and I don't really want to get into that particular discussion, but I'll give you an example. Rabbits, you know, rabbits are one of the most commonly accepted British or native animals to the UK, but actually they were introduced. They were introduced to the UK from Scandinavia, and also a lot of animals. Even the Romans introduced the large scale snails that we have, the garden snail. They were actually introduced by the Romans for food. So a lot of animals have been introduced into the UK we accept as being native. Now this is a really interesting point, and I'm sure a lot of you will be very interested in this point. Darren Naish did a great lecture, and this was back in I think 2008 for the Big Cats in Britain conference. And in that lecture he talked about the natural history of big cats in the British Isles, and what he discussed in that lecture was that actually Britain had a very, very diverse array of big cats living in Britain, actually quite recently. Now we're talking, for the leopard, the official date is 12,000 years. Now I can tell you now, them leopards that we have fossil evidence for 12,000 years, most definitely being such a successful animal in the UK, actually was probably here till a lot more recently than that. So, you know, we possibly could be talking about 2,000 years extinction time. Extinction times have been proved wrong again and again, and I've talked about the links and the sightings which continue to this day, so that's fine. So in terms of when we talk about population, we really have to put all of these other concepts into context. And you know, the 1981 Wildlife Countryside Act actually lists now what is what they call naturalised species in the UK, and a lot of you find it quite funny to find out. I was here today just walking down the path we're in Goa at the moment, and there was a few red ring-necked parakeets flew past me, and it was a split second in my mind when I thought what a beautiful tropical place this is. But actually they're actually an accepted naturalised species now of the UK. So in order for us to conceive a population of leopards in the UK, actually it's all very skewed, you know. Leopards were a native animal, probably more recently than what the textbooks make out. However, all of these other animals that we accept, or us humans believe or accept to be acceptable to be an animal, no matter how exotic they are, actually aren't native. And because a leopard, as many people will assume, is an animal that's just going to come and attack you and kill you, you know, it's too hard for people to conceive that they are living in Britain. That argument has got to be said, if there's a population or not. In time, maybe we'll never find out, maybe we will. So quite an interesting debate, and one of the most intriguing things for me is base population. I mean, how many animals do you need to create a base population? I have touched on this before. For a base population of animals, some of the reintroduction programs which have gone on for beavers, they actually start on very, very low numbers. We like to talk about breeding pairs when it comes to things like beavers and birds. I mean, the red kites, I mean, we started with a handful with a very, very diverse genetic gene pool when we reintroduced them into areas of the Chilterns. So it's not always as black and white, because one thing you've got to remember when you reintroduce an animal, like say the Sumatran tiger for instance, you don't want to be releasing just captive bred animals. We've got a mix of Siberian tiger. You know, really you've got to put back what was originally there. Now that's not always as easy, and there's other arguments there to do with breeding programs and so forth. But the general holistic image I want to give of leopards being introduced into the UK, one, you probably didn't need many releases. Now I would speculate that there was a lot of releases. That's my opinion. Over time I believe there's a lot of releases, and Dr. Vija in Poon has shown that if you catch a leopard with a territory of 1 mile, and a lot of these leopards that she catches have got very small territories, and then you release them 150 miles away, they'll travel 150 miles to get back to where they were. They have a homing instinct. So the idea that if you started with 5 leopards within a small amount of time, they're going to cover distance to find each other. That's quite a reasonable assumption. It's also a reasonable assumption if you're going to put forward the idea that if leopards are even if you have maybe 5 leopards or fewer, they're going to just live a nomadic lifestyle. The one thing that defines an animal's territory is its neighbours. When there's no neighbours, and I've talked to people like Chris Johnson who worked around big cats and is an animal behaviourist, and he said himself, if there was, and he believes personally there's probably less cats in the UK, which is fine, then you're probably going to get a nomadic type existence for any cat. So that nomadic type of existence, maybe in the early days when an animal was, animals were being released, and I speculate it was mainly the Victorian era, then it's quite reasonable to assume that there was enough, the animals were capable enough to find each other in their lifetime, enough to breed at least once. So again, not so far-fetched to believe that a population could have been seeded, because let's not make no criticisms on that point. Could a species of animals repopulate themselves? In parts of the world we think of leopards as endangered, and they are in some areas. In some areas they're thriving, and in some areas, especially northeast Africa, they're an absolute pest, you know. And actually in India they're adapting to the changes to our world. And one of the recent documentaries we saw on BBC Two, a great documentary, and it was entitled Leopards 21st Century Cats, and I think that's quite fitting, because everything I'm learning, Britain is a perfect place for the leopard. You know, people talk about reintroducing the wolf, you know, but wolves, they work in packs, they make a lot more of an impact, and you notice a wolf, the calls, the way they can bring down bigger prey and work as a team, whereas a leopard will just be there and not so far away from your village, and you'll never know it's there. So when we talk about major predators, and one is needed in the UK, the leopard is probably the best candidate for that. So interesting point again there to work on. Now, various reintroduction programs have shown that you don't really need too many animals. Topping up over time of a population is very preferable, which is, you know, is obviously a good way of monitoring the situation, and you know, you add a bit more genetic diversity. And I've talked about genetic diversity in leopards. It's not, you know, the cheetah has a massive problem with its genetics. At one time they believed that the cheetahs nearly became extinct, and then from a very few handful of animals came back, but they still have some genetic problems when it comes to breeding. Now leopards, you know, can be found from the Sahara all the way through to the tropics, even the armour leopard, and even some leopards, not exactly even the armour leopard, going up to the northern ranges or the Chinese areas, can take a lot more colder temperatures, and they're naturally adapted for that. So there is a very genetic diverse gene pool. So if you were going to start a population in Britain, you could start fundamentally with lower numbers, or even higher numbers, whichever one you choose. But the fact is, even if you have a lower number of animals with genetic diversity, you're going to have enough genetic diversity there, material, to create a good population. And I think that's the point we have to look at when we discuss some of the problems with a population just occurring in the UK. Now, one of the most common concepts when we talk about big cats in Britain, I mean, we have 3 species, as you know, the pume and the leopard and the lynx. I like to favour the leopard. We have a lot of black cat sightings, and you might notice I'm looking around all the time. We have a lot of dogs here. I'm right near the rubbish tip in Talago, and this is where the leopards have been sighted. And this is a couple of problem leopards have been reported here. So the sun's going down now, and sometimes it just gets you wondering, and I'm sure it's safe. I've done a lot of night treks in tiger country, but you never know. I know that leopards are not going to go out of their way to cause a stink, but even the dogs here can be a bit territorial. So anyway, I think someone's just lit a fire there. This is India, incredible India. We talk about incredible India. Stuff happens all the time, man, you know, and it doesn't matter. It's just anything goes in India, which is what I love. So we talk about the Dangerous Wild Animals Act. Absolutely, you know, we even have people admitting that they left animals released in that time. So that's not a problem when it comes to population, but it goes a lot deeper than that. Actually, you know, I personally think, you know, the Romans, it would have made more sense for the Romans to actually You know, they used a lot, and we see it on the mosaics, even in Britain, that we found, you know, Black Panthers fighting people. So, you know, the idea that they were going to keep bringing animals from the wild, why not? They're so easy to breed in the wild. So, actually, it would make more sense to breed them in England and use them. And who's to say none of them animals escaped? So the Romans could have been the starting point. Again, we're touching into the hideout theory there, which is a theory that maybe the leopards have been here since that 12,000 years or the Ice Age. But we don't know for certain. But the Romans are a possibility. There could have been some animals still living here. Perhaps that's a little bit more far-fetched, but still the same. It's still an idea, and it's still a possibility, as far-fetched as some people believe that would be. Travelling circuses. I mean, you go back to the 1500s, it was a very profitable industry to be in Britain, and some of the travelling communities in them times, and even in recent times, you know, they have access to animals, you know, and they can get any animal they want. And it has become quite apparent that in these circles, leopards were traded. So at what point in the 1500s, how many animals were released, we just don't know. So there's another source, 1500s, Romans, 2000 years onwards, 500 years, again, another possible cause, and in between probably loads more possible releases that would have been perfect to create a population, or at least a base population, no matter how genetically strong, to be topped up later. And I think that's the point we have to look at. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the Victorians, because the Victorians were massive experimenters, and you know, when they came to countries like India, they took animals and they brought them back to Britain. And another thing that the Victorians did, and some of the reasons we've seen all these dramatic changes in the world, was the British used to experiment with everything, with their with technologies they found from other cultures. That was one good thing, I suppose you could say. There's a lot of bad things about what the British Empire did, but they took a lot of concepts from everywhere and put them together and came up with new concepts. And another thing that they did was they took certain animals, like in Australia. I mean, they got a bit lonely in Australia, and the very rich lords who, no matter how perhaps evil they were, doing what they were in other parts of the world, they would release sheep, and they'd clear areas in Australia and have sheep, and you know, they wanted to see the odd fox. They missed home. So what did they do? They released foxes into Australia, and woe behold, very adaptable creature. Again, I've talked about foxes in London. Foxes live in Australia. You know, that Eurasian animal, as adaptable as it is, doesn't belong there. However, it survives. So Victorians experimented. There's a very interesting point. The cane toad, also in Australia, is a great point of how the British had no concept of what the very, very minute intricacies of an ecological web can do, and can create massive problems. But I think the bottom line is, you know, before we start talking about other countries and jumping in, you know, the British went everywhere and just slaughtered quite a lot of stuff. There was one guy who killed over 2,000 tigers in India. So I think before anyone from Britain starts to criticise any work anyone does in India, I mean, we've got to remember that in order to teach people about conservation in their own countries like Africa and India, we've got to start thinking about our own wilderness areas and what we can put back into the landscape, and you know, what is fitting there and what isn't. And I think that's a very, very strong point that I'd like to put across in this video. The parameters of what's acceptable and what isn't in our minds, no matter how many academics tell us this or that, doesn't always necessarily mean it's right. I think we've got to look at our actions and what we've done in the past 100 years and where we're going with that. But I think the underlying point here is the Victorians had that power. They abused that power, you know, and you know, they did used to like to hunt leopards here, and there'd be whole armies of people, you know, that would come over and they would hunt leopards and tigers. And I bet you somewhere in Britain there was an English lord, maybe in Buckinghamshire or Yorkshire or any of the home counties back in the UK, who was getting a little bit bored of hunting foxes and perhaps thought it would be interesting to just to see what would happen if they released a few dozen or maybe a dozen leopards into the UK, just to see what happened. You know, it's quite feasible because they did it with a lot of animals, and that time frame, it wouldn't take a lot for leopards to populate and to give us maximum population across the country, which a lot of quite intellectual people now accept is quite a possibility, regardless of what anyone's just going to throw out and say no. One of the things that I do in these videos is I want to just lay it out on the table what I've learned and make up our own minds, you know, not as far-fetched as some people think. So, very interesting. I'm sure that some sort of undercover reintroduction population program has happened on unofficial terms in the Victorian era, and that's my theory. But again, you know, it's an idea, it could possibly be the case, and I could absolutely understand one in the times of the Raj, an English lord, who retiring in England, you know, he had all the wealth and money across the world, he had every resource in his capabilities, perhaps a lot of time. I can see somebody turning the brain in this way and actually trying to do this, and I actually can pretty much guarantee that has probably happened. Now, is it so far-fetched that would happen? No, it's happening right now. I think it was about 2005, two guys were arrested in Yorkshire, and what they were doing was they had leopards and jaguars, and they were releasing them into the Northern Territories, the Pennines and places like that. The police actually seized a little private estate there, and they found them to have these cats, and they just admitted straight away what they were doing, and they were releasing these animals for canned hunting, and they were charging people thousands of pounds with a delay of release of maybe 2 or 3 hours, and letting the guys go out there and shoot them. And needless to say, I'm not absolutely 100% sure how many they caught, but I can pretty much guarantee that these cats can resort back to, no matter even if they were born in captivity, they can resort back to the wild, and 2 guys proved that with the tigers in Africa that they took over there. These cats know how to hunt, just like your tabby cat on your living room floor. You put it in the wild, it will do its thing, you know. They don't have to be taught anything, and I can absolutely believe that for every 1 person that's caught doing this, and these guys were caught, there's probably another 10 somewhere that haven't been caught. So even to this day, you know, how many top-ups have happened? You know, how improbable is it in the average population's mind to conceive this could even happen? But when you look at the facts, it's more than likely that it's happened. It's even more certainly that it's happened, and I think that's really interesting, and actually something to really ponder on when we talk about the possibility of these animals living in Britain and actually being a viable population also. Also, there's a lot of activists. One of the things that's come quite apparent in recent years in Britain, or even on the news in Britain, you know, people talk about reintroducing the wolf and the lynx. But I think what's happened now is, especially what's happened with the wild boar, and even to an extent with the beavers, there's these sort of quiet projects that go on of repopulation. They don't wait for the general public to have this big debate where all these irrational comments and ideas come in. These quiet projects of beaver reintroduction come in because at the end of the day, the ecologists, they've done the research, they know this stuff, they know what benefits beavers, for instance, can bring to an ecology. And people in England especially, and I don't want to be harsh on, you know, the ideas of people in Britain, but we're very, unfortunately, very slow to take on new concepts, which I find is so ironic that in the past we were so quick to come up with new ideas. In Europe, they're very, very good at realising what has been done wrong, like in Holland, and putting it back, offsetting some of the damage that they've done, and working with nature. I mean, their ability to realise that oil will run out one day, or it will become so expensive it will be uneconomical for the general population. They've really worked on renewables, and England is so far behind, and we've really got to start to sort of put our money where our mouth is, and see the light a little bit, and not be scared of these new ideas. And this is exactly what's happened with the beaver, you know. But a lot of activists now, they're not going to wait for someone to stand on their high horse and say, yes, you can do this, or yes, you can do that. Yeah, there was a case recently near the borders of Scotland. The activists released, or apparently released 6 lynxes as a protest. Now, this sort of guerrilla gardening and guerrilla releases is a new sort of concept, and it's going to happen more and more as red tape's increased. So that's another interesting angle. And people say, well, you know, how do you get hold of a leopard? How do you get hold of 10 leopards? And the Gloucestershire police on a documentary even mentioned this. You know, one of the guys there, one of the officers said, the illegal animal trade is only second to the drug trade. Drug trade is a £1 billion industry, internationally linked, and it's the same with the animal trade. And the people who are in the know can get anything, and usually it's the people in the know that have also got quite a lot of money and a lot of influence. No matter how disjointed they are from our mainstream life, they have access. And usually activists and so people, and I don't want to speculate, they also have access to the people that can get them what they want. So activists, or anarchists if you want to call them that, they release animals. So again, you know, where did they come from? You know, where are these leopards from? We don't know the whole picture, and maybe a lot of what I say is speculation. However, the options aren't completely, they're coming out of everyone's ears. There's so many sources, and not just for an original base population, but for a constant retopping up of that population, which I think is, some people call it worrying. So I would say it's quite an enlightening thought when we think of big cats in Britain.